Disclaimer to all our people watching on YouTube.
It's hot in here.
It's hot in here. Our air's not working, so. Yeah, I do film all these services. Most of you all know that, but I film them and then I upload them to YouTube, so you're just seeing me on the camera, but I film these sermons, put them up there. So anyway, God's assignments, Romans 12, 3 through 9. So we went through Romans 12, 1 through 2. And so we're going to, last week, and so we're going to read through these next couple verses here. So it says, in Romans 12, 3, in the English Standard Version, "For about the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." Verse 4 through 5 says, "For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. So we, though many, are one body, in Christ, and individually members one of another." And continuing on in 6 and 7 says, "Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy in proportion to faith, if service in our serving, the one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness." Basically what he's saying here is everybody's got a gift, and it's just a matter of how you use it and if you have the right attitude about it. In verse 3, I'm going to take it back to verse 3 for a second. Very first verse there's that word, it's the third line from the bottom, with sober judgment. Think with sober judgment. What's that word sober mean? What do you think of when you think of sober? Like you think of somebody that's not...
On drugs.
Well, somebody that's on drugs that's not anymore, right? If they got off of them drugs. Or if they got off of alcohol.
You said not, and I meant not on drugs.
Okay. So you think of somebody that's not on alcohol, not on drugs, they're not addicted anymore, maybe they're sober from pornography or something else that they're hooked on. He says think with sober judgment. Okay, last week, if you were here, we talked about Romans 12:1. And he talked about Romans 12:1 and 2. "Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Okay? Good job, Emma. Thank you. And here's the thing I gotta tell you. Renewing your mind results in sober thinking. When God changes your mind, when God changes your heart, when He does something in you that changes the way you think and the way you act, it gives you a sober mind. And what it means is it doesn't mean that you were on drugs. It doesn't mean you were addicted to alcohol or pornography. And although some people were and God saved them, that's not necessarily what it means. Really, in reality, what sober means is sound mind. It just means that you have a sound mind. You've got a mind that's not in 100 different places. Because here's the thing. I don't know how many of you have been around somebody that's drunk before, but their thoughts, what's that one phrase they say? Drunk words are sober thoughts. Like if you say when you're drunk, it's probably something you've thought before that you wouldn't say out loud, but now that you're drunk, you say it out loud because your mind's everywhere. Drinking, it messes up your mind. Doing drugs messes up your mind. Pornography messes up your mind, and you don't have a sound mind when that's the case. So a sober mind, when we say somebody got sobered up, they're not on alcohol anymore, they're not on drugs anymore, they're not addicted to whatever this is anymore, it means that they have a sound mind. Their mind's not all messed up by what they're taking in. And God is saying to have a sober judgment, which means to have a sound mind in your judgment. Is it very easy to make good decisions if you're drunk? No. Is it very easy to make good decisions if you're hyped up on drugs or if your mind is racing with all these inappropriate thoughts of sex and all these things, right? It's not possible to have a sound mind that way. It's not possible. And so we are to have a sound mind, sober thinking is what we're supposed to have. When we make decisions, when we judge ourselves, it's to be with a sober mind. We have to have God's mind. There's a verse in Scripture that talks about having the mind of Christ. We have to think the way God thinks. And that's the way to have a sound mind. When He renews your mind, when He changes your way of thinking, suddenly you don't think all distorted anymore. In the book of James it says that, it talks about in James 1 about a man that can't make up his mind. And he's like a wave tossed in the wind going to and fro. He's unstable because he can't make up. Anybody ever been having trouble to make up their mind? Yes, I know a lot of people. One in particular that's very indecisive. I'm just kidding. But anyway, so we can all be indecisive at times and say like we're unstable when we don't know what we desire or what's best for us. And when we think in a way that's indecisive, we're not really thinking with a sound mind. It doesn't mean you're not sobered up from drugs or something like that, but it's not a sound mind. A sound mind thinks properly and it thinks rightly. And that soberness, being sober, being a sound mind, affects the rest of who you are, right? Anybody ever tried to exercise and had trouble keeping it up? No motivation? Is that really a body problem or is that a mind problem? It's a mind problem, right? It's not your body. So when your mind gets renewed, everything else gets renewed. When your mind changes and when your mind is thinking soberly, suddenly everything else can fall into place. Your spiritual life, your physical life, and all these other things. Because anybody that tried to exercise and couldn't do it, most of the time it was mental. It was up here. That's why we need a sober mind. We need to think soberly. Okay? Here's the other thing. The person with a sober mind, the person with a sound mind thinks of themselves in the right way. Thinks of themselves the right way. They don't think too highly of themselves, but they don't think too low of themselves. Both are wrong. You know that? Both are wrong. It's very, very dangerous to think too highly of yourself, but in some cases it can be just as dangerous to maybe to your physical body to think too low of yourself. If you think too high of yourself, you're just proud and arrogant, and God stands against you because He said God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. But if you think too low of yourself, we know that sometimes that ends up in depression or suicide or something we don't want to have to deal with, and it could end your life. So both extremes are dangerous. But that's why we have to have the mind of Christ when we think about ourselves. The person with a sound mind thinks of himself or herself as God sees them. God doesn't see you as any better than you are, and He doesn't see you as any lower than you are. He sees you as the creature that He created, and a lot of times we don't even know what God thinks of us. Whether He's upset or happy with us at the moment, but a person that has a sound mind is going to think of themselves the way God has. You know, if you have too high a thought of yourself, if you think too highly of yourself, if you're too proud or arrogant, it's because you don't have a sound mind. You don't have a sober judgment of yourself. And if you think too low of yourself, you don't have a very sober judgment of yourself. Matter of fact, a lot of times when somebody's dealing with depression or suicidal thoughts, it's because their mind's racing with all these other things and they can't think straight. And that is the case with a lot of people. So with a sound mind, we can see ourselves as God sees us. And this is one of my favorite quotes, and I'm going to say it a few times and it's going to be on the screen. It's by a man named C.S. Lewis. I've quoted him a few times. It's not Ravenhill. Matter of fact, if I thought about putting Leonard Ravenhill on my wedding. That's how, how much, I'm just kidding. He's dead. But anyway, he's been dead for a long time, but I was just making a joke because, Anyway, everybody just likes to attack me about how much I listen to this dude. But anyway, I've got a different guy I'm quoting tonight, C.S. Lewis, and he said, okay, let me ask you this. Can somebody out there give me their definition of humility? Or being humble? I know Sean wants to say what he thinks it is. What do you think? What would you say is your definition?
That's an intimidating question, I feel like.
Yeah. Okay.
So what's your opinion?
But humiliation is, I think humiliation is the opposite of pride.
So being humble.
The very opposite of pride.
Yeah, having humility, opposite of pride. He's absolutely right in that. But here's the thing, a lot of times, especially as early beginner Christians, and I had the same exact problem in my life early on, in my Christian walk I should say, that being humble means you need to think of yourself as less than what you really are. Because man, if I think too highly of if I get to thinking I'm good at this or that, suddenly I'm proud or I'm arrogant. Or suddenly, if I start thinking that, this or that, I'm proud of myself and I'm boastful and I'm cocky, and that's not always the case. So this is my favorite quote about humility and humbleness, and it says, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself; it's thinking of yourself less." C.S. Lewis. Humility is not thinking less of yourself; it's thinking of yourself less. Thinking less of yourself leads to things like bad self-esteem, depression, suicide even, and none of those things come from God. Thinking of yourself less means putting others before you. That's humility. Being humble is loving somebody so much as to put them before you. Giving them the seat at the table. Letting them have their place in line and you step behind them.
That's tough.
One of my favorite quotes, C.S. Lewis, look it up later. So, basically in verse 3, God says that He has assigned gifts to the believers by measure of faith. And here's what I want you to know is, well, God is a giver of gifts, and often the gifts differ for every person. You know that God gives good gifts. Every good and perfect gift comes from the Father above. Every good and perfect thing in this life comes from the Father above. Now, your opinion of what perfect is different from God's more than likely. Your opinion of what's good is different from God's, because sometimes that good thing, or that thing that you think is bad, is actually working for your good. God's doing something for your good. But He's the giver of good gifts, and He gives gifts to us. He gives abilities, you might even say, to each person. But it's not because you prayed for it. It's not because you asked for it. It's not because of how spiritual you are. You don't have to be on some high level of spirituality for God to give you that gift. Imagine if your parents told you, well, you know, Jelena, we're not going to give you any Christmas gifts until you learn to ride a bike. Molly, we're not going to give you any gifts on your birthday until you're 10 years old. You got to reach this goal first, and then we'll start giving you gifts. That's not how God works, but some people think He does. Some people seem to think that if they work hard enough and if they get good enough at something, then God will give them gifts. But it's not about that. God chooses when and how to give His gifts. He assigns. You don't assign the gift. You don't get to choose. Right? He doesn't wait for you to meet some requirement before He starts giving those gifts. Now, in reality, I should say, He's given those gifts, and those gifts probably won't be expressed until you're saved, and you probably won't even recognize that gift until you're saved. But it's not about being more spiritual than somebody else. It's not about I pray more so God's going to give me this gift. It's not I read the Bible more so He's going to give me this gift and this ability. Okay? And I would say this too, if one could choose their gift, it would cease to be a gift. If one could choose their... Let me tell you something. In my family, like, we barely do Christmas anymore. Like, I see all my gifts like 5-10 days before. My parents will buy me something, or they'll say, hey, why don't you just put the code in on Amazon and buy it yourself with my money? And I'm just like,
we got you.
Right? That's what I'm saying. And Sean and Isaiah are going to ship it to me. So anyway, like, we just don't do that. Okay? Now, it is a gift from them, but a lot of us wouldn't perceive it that way, right? If I said, hey, well, let me just put it this way. When you go out to eat and somebody buys your food, do you really think of it as a gift? What would be a gift? Like when somebody surprises you on Christmas or on your birthday with something, right? That's what we think of when we think of a gift. We just think of somebody buying us our food as them being nice or kind. Now, everybody might perceive that differently. But the whole point is that you don't get to pick the gift that God gives you. It's not a gift anymore if that's the case. It's a selection. It's not a gift, it's a selection if you get to pick. No, God gives you a gift, and it's not about how good you are or how spiritual or how wonderful you are in His eyes. No, He gives you the gift based on His sovereign will and understanding of who you are. Okay, everybody has their function in the body of Christ, and you know why He's giving you that gift? I'm not talking about gifts like He gave you a pony, or He gave you a van, or He gave you this awesome pet. No, I'm talking about gifts, things that can be done in you and things that you can use to benefit the church. He has assigned all of us to a task and given us the ability to do that task, and we just don't know what it is sometimes. But I will tell you this. A lot of us think we know what someone else's gift should be. That's the problem. A lot of us think we know. You know what? I think Sean should be a youth pastor too. Did God say that? Well, He didn't say it to me, but I think that's what's best for Sean. So suddenly I start telling Sean, you ought to be a youth pastor, And suddenly Sean thinks that's what God has assigned him to. That's the gift, that's the calling on his life. And we could be totally dead wrong. Or maybe you look at somebody and you say, man, they've got a beautiful singing voice. They better be a worship leader. And you start telling them, it's not your decision what gift God assigns. Even if it looks to you like you know what the gift is. And I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit more. And see, here's the thing. This is what causes a lot of division in the church world, is we think we know how everybody else should be, or who they should be.
That's me.
You know, we say, oh, if only she would pick up the slack and teach a Sunday school class because she's a teacher in the school system, then she would have her calling. Or maybe you look at somebody else and you say, why don't they do anything to help out at church? At least they could do something like, maybe they could clean. I think everybody could clean. I'm not saying that you have to be called to clean. Everybody could clean. But my whole point is that you don't get to decide what somebody else's calling is, right? And here's the other thing. This is the scarier thing. This causes more division. The next one causes more self-esteem issues. It's that a lot of us think we know what our gift should be. A lot of you think you know what God should be giving you, and you're dead wrong. Whoa.
It's a preach, man.
Okay. I didn't know what you did. I thought you were just throwing up or something. But anyway, a lot of us think we know what our gift should be. A lot of us think, let me explain it to you. Okay?
Bring it, man.
A lot of us think that because we have this special ability and we've had it all our life, that's God's gift to us. That's what God's calling us to. And we're dead wrong. And you know what? When we find out that gift doesn't work the way we wanted it to, or things don't work out the way we expected them to, suddenly we feel bad about ourselves. Suddenly we feel bad about, we wonder if God really called us. We wonder if God has plans for us because everything seems to be going wrong or it's not working out the way it's supposed to be. This is a quote I found in the book. Francis Schaeffer is probably the greatest intellectual mind of the 20th century. You probably don't know his name, but he was a Christian thinker. That's a pretty scary thought, right? I think Sean would probably say that he's a thinker. There's not a lot of thinkers nowadays. Have you ever seen it's in, I think it's not at the museums, the thinker statue that sits there with his head on his fist, and he just thinks. Because back in the day, we didn't have iPhones, and we didn't have TikTok, and we didn't have video games, and Netflix, and Disney Plus. And you know what people had to do? They had to sit around and think. And nowadays, you can avoid thinking by getting your mind off on something else that doesn't use any of your mental capacity. And that's why we have a dumbing down of a lot of people in our generation. I remember having this argument with Isaiah about 3 years ago. Isaiah said, we're smarter than our parents because we've learned more, right? You remember this argument?
Yeah.
Okay? In theory, okay, you are more knowledgeable than Aristotle or Socrates or all these dudes that learned everything before you. To a degree, you might even be more knowledgeable than Einstein. Okay? Because you might know everything that he's taught over the last century, and now all of a sudden you learn it in school and you know more than he did. It doesn't make you wiser. It doesn't make you smarter. It doesn't make you any better of a thinker just because you know something. It doesn't. And so, we have a lack of people that think. We know a bunch of stuff, so we don't feel like it's important to think. There were people that would sit around for hours all day, centuries ago, that would just sit and think all day. Now, that can be pretty boring, I'll admit, but they did it. And Francis Schaeffer was a thinker. He was an author, he was a poet, he was a writer, he was a minister. And this is what he said: there is no proof whatsoever that our greatest natural talent is the key to our service. What does he mean by that? He means there is no proof that if you're good at singing, it means you're supposed to be a worship leader. There's no proof that just because you're good in front of a crowd, it means you're supposed to be a preacher. There's no proof that just because you're good with kids, you're supposed to run the nursery or do children's church. There's no proof that that's why you have that ability. There's no proof. See, I feel like especially in the last decade, or well, not last decade, probably the last 20 years, 30 years, there's been this emphasis on use your gifts for God. Use your gifts for God. But we put the emphasis on the wrong gifts. We talk about, oh, I'm a natural singer. I'm a natural athlete, so I'll play basketball for Jesus, which is kind of a ludicrous thing in my opinion. And that's a whole story for another time. I love basketball, but the idea of playing basketball for Jesus just doesn't mix in my opinion. But anyway, you might say, I'm a natural athlete, so that's what I'm going to do. That's my calling. Or I'm natural at, my mom was a doctor, so I'm a natural with medicine and all this kind of stuff, so God's calling me to be a doctor or a nurse. Or maybe I'm good at driving vehicles, so that means God wants me to drive trucks for Jesus, which I do believe you can do, particularly if you're driving Bibles or something of the sort to other people that haven't heard before, right? But the whole point is that just because you're good at something doesn't mean that's what God's calling you to. Matter of fact, it's more than likely that He's not. It's more likely that He's not. See, David was a shepherd and a musician, but God used him best on the battlefield. Why do we think about it like that? We think, oh, David was just a little guy. He was probably 17, 18 years old when he took on Goliath. Why is it such a special thing? Because David wasn't a warrior. He was a shepherd boy. He was a musician. So why is it so special? Because God empowered David to do those things. God empowered David. It wasn't really David that beat Goliath. It was God through David that did. And that's why it's so special. And here's the thing. You may not know this too, but Moses, right? Moses. Has anybody ever seen the movie Prince of Egypt, the animated movie? Really good movie about Moses. You ought to watch. Moses, he parted the Red Sea. God used him to declare the 10 plagues. He wrote the 10 Commandments. He wrote the first 5 books of our Bible. He was in charge of millions of people. But he told God, remember that story about at the burning bush? Moses sees the burning bush and God starts speaking to him out of it. Well, he told God, he said, you know what, God, I'm not very good at public speaking. So maybe, just maybe you should talk to somebody else. Somebody like maybe Sean Jesse, who's good in front of a crowd. Or maybe somebody like Micah Coverstone, who can get up in front of people and talk, because I'm not good at getting in front of people and telling them what they need to hear. So maybe you need to find somebody else. And God said, no, you're the one I've chosen. And he ends up using his brother Aaron to that degree to some extent. But anyway, Moses was not gifted. Matter of fact, he says he stuttered. There's a possibility that Moses had a speech impediment. And God said, I want you to speak. That's what I've called you to. See, Moses thought he knew what God should call him to. Moses thought he knew what God should choose for him to be. And Moses was wrong. But when Moses embraced that God had a different plan for him than Moses did, suddenly Moses becomes one of the most powerful and important figures in the Bible, in history. See, it's all because of this verse. 2 Corinthians 12:9. But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. What is he talking about here? This is Paul writing this. You know what happened to Paul? He said, I have a thorn in my flesh. There's a lot of differences of opinion on what that thorn in the flesh meant. But my personal opinion, I think the opinion of most people, is that Paul had some sort of medical condition that hindered him from doing certain things. And I personally believe it was an eye condition because of another letter he wrote in the Bible that talks about how he said, you all would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. Basically saying, I was having trouble when I came to you. My sickness was a trouble to you, and it had to do with my eyes. And so a lot of people believe that Paul's thorn in his flesh was an eye problem. He had some sort of hindrance physically. And he asked God 3 times. He says, God, take this away from me. No. God, take this away from me. No. God, I don't want this anymore. Take it away from me. No. Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. You're weak, Paul. That's what I want. I want somebody that's weak. I want somebody that can't do everything for themselves. I want somebody that can't do everything on their own power. I want somebody that can't do everything on their own ability. I want someone that has to rely on me. See, that old adage that says, God will never give you more than you can handle, is a load of absolute garbage. Anybody that tells you that, they're wrong. It's a common phrase, so if they say it, I'm not saying that they're stupid. I'm just saying it gets thrown around a lot, and people don't even know what it means. God gives you more than you can handle, or at least he allows you to have more than you can handle. You know why? Because David couldn't have handled Goliath on his own. Moses couldn't have public spoke on his own. Paul couldn't have preached the gospel on his own because of his condition. God's power was made perfect in that weakness. And that's how God gets the glory when you're weak, because then they can see that you're strong. Nobody would be surprised if LeBron James won another championship.
No.
Right? Nobody would be surprised because he was such a good basketball player. Nobody would be surprised if Michael Jordan came to your school and he did a windmill dunk. Who's going to be surprised by that? But you know what? I'd be surprised if I did. If I got up there and did a windmill dunk, let me tell you, it's not because of me. It's not because of my power.
Oh, I know.
Because God's power is made perfect in weakness. What about that story in Scripture where Elijah, he just has this battle with priests basically, and what he does is he basically proves that God is the real God. And then For 2 years, Elijah had declared there would be no rain in Israel. And for 2 years it didn't rain. There was a famine in the land. And Elijah, after this whole battle on Mount Carmel where he convinces all the people that there's only one God and it's the God of heaven and earth, it's Yahweh, it's Jesus, all of a sudden he says, I hear the sound of rain coming. You know what Elijah does? He takes off running. And it says that Elijah ran all the way to Jerusalem faster than the chariots, faster than the horses. I bet nobody was saying, sure, Elijah sure is fast. He must have run track. He's running faster than the horses. Why? Because normal people can't do that. Elijah was too weak to run that fast, but God gave him the ability. What about when Moses parted the Red Sea? Was it really Moses? I mean, if we try to part, has anybody ever seen that video online of the dude that's got the broomstick out and he's sweeping the waves back into the water? It's like I think it's an Oriental guy, which means Asian if you didn't know. And he's pushing the waves, like they're all coming back up, and he's just got this broom in the sand and he's just pushing it back. I guess to be funny, right? But the whole point is that we can't part the waters. God's power is made perfect in weakness. Moses was too weak to do that. And you know what? Your gift, your calling has to do with your weaknesses. Because God shines best when you're weak. Because it shows that He's strong. God shines best when you're weak. That's why we don't need superstars preachers in fancy outfits and $500 shoes. Okay? Let me tell you something. Okay? Stephen Furtick. I don't know if you all listen to him. I think he's a great guy. I used to listen to him a lot. But he's good in front of a crowd and he can speak a pretty good message. But you know what? It's pretty show. You don't need $500 shoes if you're a preacher. You don't need an $1,000 outfit or fancy lights or any of that kind of stuff. Why? Because suddenly the spotlight's on you and how great you are. And it's supposed to be on the Lord. And I don't know, maybe there's probably a lot of preachers throughout history and pastors nowadays where they were just good at public speaking and somebody said, you know what, you're pretty good in front of a crowd, you should be a pastor. And that was the worst thing they could have told him. You know, listen, I heard my dad say this during a sermon one time, and this is some serious stuff right here. I wish I had it on the PowerPoint to tell you. Some of the worst advice you could give somebody is to tell them to just be themselves. I assume you want to tell that to Hitler. Well, just be yourself, Hitler. Well, he was. And you know what? He was a vicious, vile person. Or Ted Bundy. Who knows who Ted Bundy was? They put some documentaries out there about Ted Bundy. The guy that raped and murdered a bunch of women. You want to tell him just to be himself? I even think that's some of the worst advice you give a Christian is be yourself. Oh, well, I'm good at singing, so God must be calling me to be a worship leader. I can play guitar. So I'm not saying that you can't use your gifts that He's given you in that way, because I don't think God's called me to be a worship leader, okay? I play guitar, and so I've offered up to use that gift. I play drums. I've offered up to use that gift in His service on the worship team here at church and here on Wednesday nights. But my whole point is that there's no promise that that's really what you're called to do just because that's what you're good at. There's no promise to that. Be yourself is not great advice. Maybe unless it's in an awkward social situation. You say, I don't know if I want to go to this party because there's some people I don't know. Well, just be yourself. That might help you out a little bit. But anyway, we have got to be cautious of what we think of ourselves. Because only God really knows who we truly are and who we're truly meant to be. So we need to be cautious not to have a false evaluation of ourselves. We can't think too highly. We can't think too low of ourselves, because that is the complete opposite direction of how God sees us. Nothing could be worse than a Christian who overrates him or herself. Nothing could be worse than a Christian that thinks they're all the stuff. Nothing could be worse than a Christian that just wants everybody to know how good they are at everything they can do. Because you know what? Then you realize and find out that God probably has no place in their life because they seem to do everything fine by themselves. That's how you know when somebody's operating on their own power, is they give themselves the glory. There's a story that Dick Brogden, a missionary, spoke, and he talked about this, and he said that one time somebody died that he was working with at a missionary compound, and somebody had died, and they put him, or I think it may have been a her, but either way, the person that died, they put him in the back of the car, and just the dead body, because they didn't have a hearse or anything. This is in Africa, Asia area, okay? And they finally get the body to some facility, and Dick Brogden puts out his hand and prays over the body, hoping and just hoping that this would be the next Lazarus, and this person would raise from the dead and say, "Thank you, Dick Brogden, for praying for me. If it wasn't for you, I'd still be dead." And you know what? He prayed and he trusted and he had faith that God would heal that person and that suddenly they'd be living again. And guess what happened? The person stayed dead. And Dick Brogden said he learned a great lesson in that God told him, he said, "Until I can trust you with my glory, I can't trust you with my power. I'm not going to give you the power to heal people or to lay your hands on somebody and them be blind and suddenly see. I'm not going to give you the power to be anointed with the Holy Spirit and to do all these miracles and healings until you know that it's not just you that's doing it, it's me." Right? And maybe that's why we have such a low, small amount of miraculous things happen, is everybody wants the glory for themselves. But that's not what God's called us to. Everybody wants everybody to see us, but that's not humble, and that's not acknowledging the gifts that God has given you, which are often different from the gifts that you think that He's given you. And here's the other thing. So this whole point in the next few verses that I read, about verses 6, 7, 8, and 9 of Romans 12, he talks about how everybody has a gift in the church. You all have a responsibility as members of the church to use your gifts for others. And he said some people prophesy, some people preach, some people exhort, which means to encourage. And maybe somebody teaches, somebody who gives a lot. Everybody has a role. Everybody has a thing to fill. But there's been problems in the church world in the New Testament. This was one of the problems. And Warren Wiersbe sums it up that spiritual gifts are tools to build with, not toys to play with or weapons to fight with. And see, when we have even a gift that, like maybe we're good at guitar or singing or basketball, and it's not really the gift that God has assigned to us in this way, suddenly we start using that gift for our own glory, which leads to fights and leads to trouble and leads to dissension and division and all these kind of issues. But when we're bringing God glory, when we're using the gifts He's given us and He gets all the glory for it, suddenly we don't treat those gifts like they're something to fight other people with or be more spiritual than somebody else or to be stronger or better or more holy than somebody else. Suddenly we realize it's really God and who He is and what He's done. We have to operate in our gifts in faith. It takes faith. Listen, it takes faith. This is the last few things I'm going to say. It takes faith to operate in your spiritual gift. You know why? It doesn't take, Sean, does it take much faith for you to stand up there and shoot a basketball and make it? Why? Because you've done it so many times. Molly, Hannah, whoever does this, does it take much faith to stand up there and sing a song on stage? Why? Because you've done it. It's your gift. It's a gifting that you have naturally. Carl, does it take much faith to get up there and hit a baseball? Yeah. Oh, does it? Yeah. Right. You've done it so many times. Maybe all that you really need in those moments is faith in yourself. But when God gives you a gift, you have to put faith in Him because you can't perform that gift. You can't perform that function. You can't do those things without His power. So you have to have a level of faith. Just like Moses, when he said, "I can't speak, I stutter," and God said, "Well, you're going to speak anyway." Moses had to have faith because he couldn't do it on his own ability. He couldn't put faith in himself. And he recognized that. He thought too low of himself. But God said, "You know what? You're going to trust in me." You're not to be sure of yourselves, you're to be sure of God and His power. That's why some Christians get accused of being cocky and bold, and they aren't. Now, some are. But many of those who have been the greatest men and women throughout history have appeared cocky or bold to other people because they trusted in the Lord. And nobody could tell them they were wrong, not because they thought that they couldn't be wrong, but because they knew He couldn't be wrong. They knew that the Lord couldn't be wrong. They had their faith in Jesus. They had their faith in the Lord. And so it takes faith to operate in the gift. Now, I don't know what your gifting is. I can't stand here and say, "Oh, Kylie is called to bake stuff the rest of her life." I can't say that. Are you good at baking? Well, then maybe that is her gifting. I don't know. But the whole point, I can't tell you what that is, but God can show you, and God can minister to you, and it takes faith, because when God calls us to do something, it's got to be in faith, because without faith, we cannot please God. Faith relies on God for the outcome. It doesn't rely on ourselves. It doesn't rely on what we can do. And that keeps our judgment of ourselves sober. It keeps it sound in mind, and it brings God the glory. Could anything be better? We're not to think too highly. We're not to think too low. We're to be sure of not ourselves, but of God and what He's done. You know, like I said, I can't tell you what your gifting is. I don't know what God's going to call you to in this life. But He's calling every believer, anybody that believes in Him, He's calling you to something, and He's got something for you to do. And like I said, it's probably not what you expect. And that's how you know it's God. You want to know part of the reason I knew that Emma was the one for me is because at that time in my life, I was not interested in a girlfriend. I told myself I was going to wait until I was 25, 26 to marry somebody. I wasn't interested. I was going to be single for a long time. And then that kind of got sprung on me, and I realized, hey, wait a second. Maybe God has a plan in this because His plans are always better than mine. His plans are often different from mine. And that's how I know He's now. Just every time that something comes up that's opposite of what you wanted in life doesn't mean it's God. Okay? But often your gifting is just not going to be what you expect it to be. What He's calling you to. I mean, would you look at some of the druggies in your school and say, man, one day you're called to preach? But you know what? Some of the best ministers of the gospel ever in history have been people that got off drugs.
Man, tell him, Tony.
Exactly. Tony Brown. I've been texting him today.
Man.
So I want us to find our gift. And here's the thing. Knowing what your gift is, knowing what God's gifting you with or putting on your life to do, it won't come immediately. Like, it's not going to be like, God, what's my gift? And He's like, comes down and stands face to face with you and says, man, you are going to be a waitress the rest of your life, and you're going to be the best waitress there ever was. You're going to tell people about Jesus as a waitress, or you're going to be a taxi driver and tell people about Jesus, or you're going to be a preacher, or something like that. And these gifts are also talking about what you're going to do in church. It doesn't mean He'll come down and say, you got to be a nursery worker. Boom. You're going to exhort people. You're going to be an encourager. You're going to be a board member. You're going to be a youth pastor, or a worship leader, or you're going to be an usher, or you're going to be the person that cooks for the church. No, it doesn't mean He's going to just come and say it, but God can show us. And I want us to spend a little bit of time tonight praying that God would show us what His calling is for us, what His gift is for us, how He wants to use us, because over the next coming few weeks and months and years in this youth group, we're going to have more opportunity to express our gift in the service, in this time. Because God's been laying some stuff on my heart about how we need to reorganize some of that so that you all can have the opportunity to walk in your gifts and grow in it. So here's what I want you to do, is I'm going to turn on some music here in a minute, and I just want you to find a place in the room. Many of you have done this before. I want you to find a spot in the room, and I want to put the music on for just a little bit of time. And I want you to just pray to the Lord. I want you to say, God, what is my gifting? What is my calling? Maybe if you're not right with the Lord right now, you need to say, God, help me get right. Change some things in my life. Help me get rid of this sin. Help me defeat sin. And so, if you would go just find a spot anywhere. It could be in a seat. It could be in a corner. It could be anywhere. Just spread out and begin to pray. God, what is my gifting? Show me. And it doesn't mean He's going to show you tonight. It doesn't mean He's going to answer you. But over time, He's going to begin to show you what He's calling you to.